study of the national economy, which became sort of the field of Keynesian economics, among other things, became separated from this kind of analysis, and with the stagflation of the 1970s, lost caste and status with economists and statesmen. The unit of analysis was, in fact, the individual actor. And, of course, this kind of economics was very, very useful in the Cold War because it opposes Marxian socialism, which stands for the collectivity. Closely related to these developments, although not ideologically, was the growth of cognitive psychology, especially cognitive behaviorism, which projects the brain as the center of the individual and the center of the psyche, which is very different from early 20th century behaviorism, which pretty much ignores the brain. And that's a long story, which I won't bore you with here, at least in the talk. And the emphasis is on the rational individual, so that you have people talking about how you can improve education. Jerome Bruner does one kind of thing. The people who fuel up Head Start, which is one of my favorite programs, do the other. Compensatory education for underprivileged children, or improving education, improving math and science education, increasing cognition, however you do it. Game theory, 4. As first developed by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern in the late 30s and the 1940s, emphasized rational choice decision-making, that is the ability of the individual rational person to make strategic choices among alternatives. One of the simple example is the prisoner's dilemma, in which two men are arrested for a crime, and if they will squeal on the other, they'll get off free, and if they don't, they'll spend years in jail. And so the question is, are they going to betray their buddy or not, for self-interest? 5, war games, which were developed at the Rand Corporation and elsewhere, posited a rational mind on both sides of the war. Thus, Thomas Schilling was perhaps the major architect of our escalation strategy. He was a Harvard economist who was on loan to Rand and also the Department of Defense. It was he who came up with the bright idea that we could bomb the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to the negotiating table. If we just increased enough pressure, rationally, dropped enough bombs, they would eventually give up. Well, who left Vietnam? Schilling got a Nobel Prize. So that shows where it's at. The law. Here we have two streams of legal thought and action since the 1950s. Both emphasize the rational individual. The first, which called process jurisprudence, stressed that there were all manners of institutions involved in the process of legal decision-making, which ultimately was based on the rational individual and which cherished the rights of the individual over that of the collectivity or the group. That was basically a conservative jurisprudence, and that's more or less what you've got on the Supreme Court now, except it's not a very good version of it. It's not a particularly intelligent version of it, but that's another story. The other version of process journalism was critical legal theory, which is the left-wing version rather than the right-wing version. And here it was pushed by such individuals as Harvard's Duncan Kennedy, who's been sort of a stormy petrel at Harvard for many, many years, and stressed how the legal system was oppressing individuals, especially members of minorities, and how important it was to rescue these people and find justice for them. A final example, see, we're coming right in at 45 minutes. A final example is that of positive political theory, which is a combination of game theory and rational choice decision-making. Here, the key individual was a man named William H. Riker. And yes, there's a Riker on Star Trek who's named for him. It's really true. It's the University of Rochester who argued in The Theory of Political Coalitions, published in 1963, that n-number competitive zero-sum game theory could be extended to political decision-making. The individual voter, the jury, the city council, whatever. So everything is individuated, and so what you do is you work out the diagrams of the game theory as to what's going to happen. The point was always to maximize gain, according to Riker. Therefore, you could always predict what people were going to do, because people will always act in their rational self-interest. Okay. Maybe we've come full cycle. What we have here, I think, in conclusion, is a very rich and complex tradition, to which I've barely done any justice at all. That of how a free society and a modern society have attempted to deal with the issues of human nature and conduct. To a very great extent, the social sciences have done this, although quite differently in different eras of our national history, which gives us a sense that what I'm talking about is the impact of society upon science, not science upon society. And obviously, the soil has been plowed and fertilized for the genomic revolution. All I can say is what we used to say in atomic bomb drills in school, duck and cover. Thank you.
Please go to the mic. I would just like to
Yes.
present him with his 2007 Distinguished Arts and Humanities Scholar, Hamilton Cravens, Professor of History, Historian, Teacher, Iowa State University, September 2007. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled. Thank you very much. Yes, and I think I'm going to have a glass of water. I'll be glad to dodge any questions you want to throw at me. Irv?
You didn't mention two animal behaviors.
Two what? I'm sorry?
Two animal behaviors who were Nobel laureates eventually. Konrad Lorenz and Nicholas Tinbergen, who brought up the idea of instinct.
Right. Well,
Do they fit in, or are they?
yeah, sure they do. Sure they do. Because where they fit in is with the revival of the interest in the biological in the 1960s, is kicked off by people like Ardrey and many other people. Sure. And actually, Lorenz is sort of a voice in the wilderness in the 50s and 40s. But sure. Now, one of the things that happens is that instinct doesn't mean in 1970 what it meant in 1910 or 1890. Okay?
Okay. I got another question.
Please.
I've just read a book called Getting Serious About Sustainable Cities, and it's written by Kevin Portney, and he talks about this idea of individualism and communitarianism. And he tried to find a common thread in the cities that he found ranked high in how they are becoming sustainable. Most of these are on the West Coast or the East Coast, but there's a few in the Midwest. And the only thing that he could find was that the sustainable cities, those that really were taking it seriously, had a strong sense of communitarianism.
Of community or communitarianism?
Of community and communitarianism, yeah. And he didn't know whether that caused them to become sustainable or whether sustainability was the other way, but it was interesting.
The answer is yes to both. Yeah, and actually, one of the trends in urban planning, which I didn't talk about, is this interest in metroplexes, in which you talk about a particular part of a city and what that particular part does for the larger whole, but you don't talk about the larger city. Now that's a lack of community. And this is very common in urban planning. Yes, John?
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Just fine.
Good.
Yeah, I just have a quick question about, I'm curious about the causality you see in terms of this transition from group to individual and the focus of social science.
Right.
Like, what factors do you see at work at causing that shift to occur?
How do I explain it causally?
Yeah, insofar as, I mean.
Well, I think it's a very complicated question, and I think my answer is very simple. I don't.
Oh, okay.
In other words, I think that history is very good at explaining how things happen. When it gets to the why, it gets very, very, very tricky because, you look at something happening and it goes in a line. And I could talk about any one of these examples or anything else, and it'd be the same. And then you say, well, gee, okay, I've got something. Let's see how that was impacting something else. Turns out the same thing is happening in another area of life, totally removed from that, maybe even in another country, but it's parallel to it. Well, if everything's parallel to everything else, I don't know what you can talk about causation. Maybe correlation. Okay. But even then, I'm really hesitant because it's awfully hard. Now, and also, of course, as you know, most of what historians argue about, at least in modern history, I don't know much about early modern or ancient history, is causation. They don't argue so much about how, but why. And a lot of it's ideological. There's some ideology in what I'm doing, but I'm trying to keep that out of what I'm doing as much as I can. I suppose I'd say that as the culture changes, everything else does, but I don't know where that gets you. It seems to me to be a fatuous argument.
Well,
so I'd rather not.
So you won't hazard any guesses, even.
What?
You won't hazard any guesses, even.
Over a glass of wine,
okay,
sure.
Deal.
But I mean, strictly speaking, I think it's very, very tricky to do that. And your guess is as good as mine, in a sense. Thanks, John, for the question. I appreciate these questions. Hi there.
Hi. I have a question about how you view social networking. Is that an attempt for people to form a group, or is this just the definition of an individual looking for an audience?
I think the simple answer is it happens. I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
The reason I'm asking that question, when you're talking about collective authority, immediately Wikipedia sprang to mind. And then I'm thinking, the world is getting smaller because we're all communicating in a different format. And does that mean we're looking to be part of a group, or does that mean as individuals we're just looking to proclaim our authority?
The latter. At least I don't see much hope for a rebirth of community. I look at how empty movie theaters are, how there are so few collective experiences we have anymore. And I don't think it's just us.
Hi, Hamilton.
Hi, Charlie.
How are you?
Fine. How are you?
Good.
Good.
I don't know if it's a question. You make it a question for me, please. But I accept the idea that there's this interest, this focus on individuality, at the same time that Madison Avenue, Detroit, the large home builders, Vance Packard, the hidden persuaders, are all aiming to try and create us into a predictable mass to make it easier to sell to.
Sure.
And actually taking away that as the McDonaldization of roadside restaurants rather than roadhouses, and on and on. How do you reconcile the trend in the social sciences compared to the trend in advertising, which has to reflect some knowledge of the social sciences or psychology theory to be able to market?
It does, and what they're trying to do is to develop standardized tastes in us. And what happens is you get more and more different kinds of McDonald's.
And not that I like that, but isn't that a form of community?
Maybe.
Not that I want that, I mean.
No, I mean, maybe it is.
You and I don't go to McDonald's for lunch. We go out and get hot Chinese soup. But still, isn't that a form of community? Just, we don't
But
care
that's
for
two. Thank you. Thank you for, yeah. Any more questions?
Yeah, I don't think this thing is working, so I'll just talk real loud. What,
Okay.
Okay. Getting back to what Irv mentioned, and you briefly alluded to, what do you think the implications are for urban planning? Since clearly sustainability and the climate and is all wrapped up with that, and I gather you don't think much of current urban. Just talk about that for a couple minutes.
Oh, I think a lot of sustainability.
Not sustainability, urban planning, ideas about.
Oh. Well, I've written about professionals, as you know, Maureen, for a long time, and I've become a little jaded, I guess, and a little more interested in what ordinary people have to say. And I've also become very depressed by our political system, which seems to be more interested in dynasties and getting reelected at any cost than in solving problems. There's a lack of leadership, and without leadership you can't have community or anything like that. And so I guess my view of the future is pretty grim. That's not a nice answer. I'm sorry. Yeah, could you come over here, please? I've trouble hearing.
It's not working.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You seem to be sort of positive about Head Start. I was just wondering if the guy who sort of spearheaded Head Start done something right, that the guy who said we'll bomb North Vietnam into agreement got wrong.
Right.
So maybe you could contrast those two and or just say something why you like the guy who did Head Start.
Well, it isn't the guy, it's the guys. And it's people who, it's really women who work in early childhood education. The question was, how come I like the people in Head Start and I don't like the escalators, right? Essentially. Thomas Schilling and people like that. Well, I mean, but people in early childhood education knew that if you work with kids who were disadvantaged, sooner or later you get results. It's just that nobody would believe them. And there's a long story behind that that's over there, where I'll be glad to explain in more detail. But the people who did the game theory were just sitting there diagramming things. They didn't have any real life experience. And I would suggest there's a cautionary tale in that someplace. That's a shorthand answer, Joe.
So having some real life experience gave them better theory, whereas the guys who were predicting bombing North Vietnam into the peace table had nothing to go on except some abstract understanding of human nature.
Well, they probably had some things to go on. But I mean, they assumed, for example, you see that, no, wait. Schilling and people like him assumed that the North Vietnamese had the same values we did. Give me a break. I mean, I read 3 books on the U.S. and Vietnam when I was at Ohio State in the mid '60s because I had to teach this stuff, and I said, "My God, have I been wrong?" We didn't take, I was writing my dissertation, and I could figure that out.
What I was trying to get at was there a difference in approach in social science? Because that was the theme.
Yeah, I don't know if they matter very much. Because except that the difference between direct experience and abstraction. I think abstraction has an important role to play. I wouldn't denigrate that for anything. But everything in proportion and balance. And, depends on the questions you ask. It's the methods you have and the answers you come up with, as you know. You know that better than I do. I can barely hear you, Linda. I'm sorry.
What would you say about the idea of the global community as opposed to the kind of traditional communities that you were talking about? As I understood, you were saying, kind of the community's gone. And I guess my question is, I think of my kids and their interaction with people all around the world on the internet, something that I never did at that age. And it seems like the way of participating in the community has changed. and expand it. And I guess I would just like to know your thoughts on that.
Does work on the, if I can, I had trouble hearing you, and I apologize. That's my problem. But what you're saying basically is interconnected is on the web a new kind of community? Possibly. But I don't know what it leads to. I mean, it leads to sitting in there and, you know, I mean, I don't see that it leads to collective action, except in certain kinds of special cases, as with organizations like MoveOn. That sort of thing. But it has to be directed. It can't just happen. It can't be spontaneous. I like to think of a community as something that is relatively spontaneous.
I think it seems like there's as much more conformity as there ever was. And so I don't know if that's a byproduct of community or not. But I mean, I have that same thought that, you know, people are sitting there more and more isolated, but yet they're kind of reaching out in a different way, and that, I don't know, the fads, the fashions, the mores, whatever, are still being transmitted in whatever way.
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if they are or not. I mean, all I know is that my kids are terrific. I mean, that's all I can really say. Thank you for your patience, and there's more bread and circuses. Hi there. He was a brilliant. Yeah. Oh, very much so. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Did they complete it?
Yeah. Are you playing this weekend?
That's right. That's absolutely right. No, he was a brilliant man, and he's nothing like his descendants. Much more humane. there is. I've written a lot about it. No, I think as a matter of fact, Europe and America form a common civilization. And always we want to come up with land. And in fact, what I find is that Carolyn is always modernist conquest. I didn't really understand that when I lived in Germany. And got good enough at the language that I could actually understand it. And read the newspapers and listen to the radio. The parents. There's different outcomes and different cultures. It's the same, but the issues are the same. It's just that you have a different outcome in Germany than you do in the United States. But there's a concern about it. I think it's really hard. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know how you do it.
You really can't. Yeah.
Well, you can pretend.
Projecting your stuff on.
Yeah. You can pretend. And you can suggest. But that's what you're doing. And that's why I didn't go to the issue. First, I had with all John Rose because he knows perfectly well. He's a very smart he just got on his own life. And as a scholar, well, I think it's called guessing. What? I think it's called guessing. Yes. Yes. Yes.
I've always been, I actually am a scientist, and I've been extremely fascinated by history.
What kind of science?
I work at the vet school where I organize and neurology. So, yeah, I'm actually considering doing some graduate work in the RPC program. Because the history of science, taking that class, I was one of the only students that ever had in that class who was trying to take the target of history of science and how it tied into the stories. It fascinated me, and I couldn't really bring it. Yeah, let me collect my thoughts. I just moved into a new house. I need to get yeah, it's something that we do. This entire building.
You have the right to do it. Yeah. Well, I think they've done a fabulous we wanted to ask you how were you thinking? Yes, that was a very popular book. It's an interesting That's one of Hi, Susan. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm just, I never would have thought it. Just, I mean, that's. I wrote this. About the course I wrote. Right. No, I had a dissertation. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I think there are. Well, what do you think about you've got a lot of commonality.